After months of deployment overseas, all I wanted was peace. I had counted the days until I could return to my own home, imagining the comfort of my living room, the smell of my favorite coffee brewing in the morning, and the quiet safety of a neighborhood I once thought I belonged to. But what I didn't know was that my absence had turned into someone else's opportunity, and that person was none other than the infamous HOA Karen. The moment I arrived at my street, something felt off. The driveway wasn't empty as I had left it. Instead, there was a strange car parked there. Curtains that had once been mine were replaced by tacky blinds, and flower pots I had never seen sat on the porch. Confused, I walked up to the door, trying to convince myself there must be a mistake. When I pushed my key into the lock, it didn't turn. My key, the one I'd carried halfway across the world, suddenly didn't belong to this house. I knocked. A man I had never seen before opened the door. His face carried a mix of confusion and annoyance, as if I were the intruder. "Can I help you?" he asked sharply. "This is my house," I replied firmly. But instead of apologizing or explaining, he told me he was renting the place and had a lease signed through the HOA. That's when it hit me like a punch to the gut. Karen, the neighborhood busybody who had always poked her nose into everyone's business, had somehow taken control of my home. I tried to remain calm, but anger boiled beneath my skin. "Who gave you permission?" I asked. He pointed toward the HOA office and casually mentioned Karen's name. My jaw clenched. This was no misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act. I called the police, but when they arrived, the officer explained it wasn't a simple break-in case. Since the tenant had a signed lease, it was now a civil matter. I was advised to seek legal help. The tenant closed the door on me, leaving me outside of my own home, humiliated and furious. That night, instead of sleeping in my bed, I stayed at a nearby motel, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The betrayal stung. How could someone in the very community I defended while deployed do this to me? HOA Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, and I was determined to fight back, no matter how messy it would get. The next morning, I went straight to the HOA office, documents in hand. Karen was there, sitting smugly at her desk as if she ruled the entire neighborhood. Her expression barely flickered when I confronted her. "You rented out my house," I snapped. Karen gave a dismissive shrug. "Well, technically, you abandoned it. HOA bylaws state that properties left vacant for more than 6 months fall under temporary management. We had to make sure the community didn't suffer from an empty house." Her words nearly made my blood boil. "Abandoned? I was deployed, serving my country." "You knew that?" Karen smirked, clearly enjoying the control she thought she had. "The neighborhood can't revolve around one person's military schedule. Renters bring in revenue. Besides, the tenant signed a lease. Nothing illegal here." But I wasn't about to take her word for it. I left, determined to find out exactly how she pulled this off. I contacted a lawyer specializing in property rights. After reviewing my case, he confirmed what I suspected: Karen had overstepped her authority. HOA bylaws did not give her the right to lease my property, especially without my explicit permission. Still, it wasn't going to be easy. Legal battles with HOAs were notorious for dragging on. In the meantime, I wanted to know how deep this scheme went. I started talking to neighbors, gathering bits and pieces of information. One neighbor revealed they'd seen people moving into my house weeks ago, but assumed I had given permission. Another admitted Karen had boasted at a community meeting about finding a better use for the soldiers' house. Each story only fueled my determination. That evening, I returned to the property to confront the tenant again. He wasn't hostile this time, perhaps realizing the situation wasn't as clear-cut as Karen had made it seem. "Look, I just signed a lease. I didn't know anything about this," he said. I almost felt sorry for him. But my sympathy was drowned out by frustration. My own bed, my own belongings, and the space I had worked hard to afford were being used by strangers. All because Karen decided she had the right to dictate my life. As I walked away from the property again, my lawyer's words echoed in my head. "You have a strong case. She's going to regret this." That was the fuel I needed. Karen might have played her game well, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The legal process began quickly. My lawyer filed a complaint against both the HOA and Karen personally, citing unauthorized leasing of private property and interference with ownership rights. The day we served her with papers, I wished I could have bottled the look on her face. It was the first time her smug confidence faltered. But Karen wasn't about to back down easily. She hired her own attorney, and soon the HOA meetings turned into war zones. She painted me as an absent owner who neglected his duty to the community, twisting my deployment into a weapon against me. Some board members nodded along, clearly intimidated by her. Still, others whispered encouragement when Karen wasn't around. They knew she had gone too far. I wasn't the first person she had tried to control, but I was the first willing to fight her head on. The case dragged on for weeks. Court hearings, depositions, and endless paperwork tested my patience. Every time I entered the courtroom, Karen sat across from me with that same sharp-eyed glare, as though daring me to give up. But every time I reminded myself this wasn't just about me. It was about standing up against people who misuse power simply because they can. When my lawyer presented evidence, emails, Karen had sent authorizing the lease without board approval, testimony from neighbors who overheard her boasting, and a copy of the fraudulent rental contract. The judge's expression darkened. It was clear the tide was turning. Karen's attorney tried to argue that HOA bylaws gave her temporary management rights, but my lawyer countered with the fact that temporary management referred to emergency maintenance, not profiteering. Renting out my house wasn't just overreach, it was exploitation. Meanwhile, I endured sleepless nights waiting for justice. The thought of strangers living in my home made every day harder. I drove past the house often, watching lights flick on and off, hearing laughter inside. It felt like I was being robbed in slow motion. But finally, the court date arrived for the judge's preliminary ruling. Karen strutted into the room, heels clicking like a victory march. I sat quietly, hands clasped, heart pounding. This was it. The moment truth would finally outweigh her arrogance. The judge looked directly at Karen. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear the HOA president exceeded her authority. The property belongs solely to the plaintiff, and no clause within the bylaws grants the right to lease it without written consent. The lease is hereby voided. Karen's jaw tightened, and for the first time her confidence cracked. When the gavel came down, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The tenant was ordered to vacate the property immediately, and Karen was held personally liable for damages. The judge even imposed fines on the HOA for negligence, ensuring they would think twice before letting her run unchecked again. Walking out of the courtroom, Karen's face was pale with rage. "You'll regret this," she hissed. But her words carried no weight anymore. The law had spoken, and for once, her intimidation tactics had failed. Returning to my house days later was surreal. The tenant had moved out, leaving behind little more than an empty fridge and a couple of broken blinds. But when I opened the door with my key, the one that finally worked, again, it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Every corner of the house carried memories, and now it was mine once more, free from Karen's grasp. Neighbors who had stayed silent before now approached me with handshakes and apologies. Many admitted they had been afraid to stand up to Karen, worried she'd target them next. My victory gave them hope that the HOA wasn't untouchable. As for Karen, word spread quickly that she had been forced to resign as HOA president. Her reputation was ruined, and the same community she once controlled now whispered about her downfall. Watching her walk away from the neighborhood, defeated and humiliated, was a sight I'll never forget. I realized then that this battle wasn't just about property, it was about resilience. Deployment had taught me discipline and endurance, but this fight taught me something else. Never let anyone strip away your rights, no matter how powerful they seem. Standing in my living room, sipping coffee from my favorite mug, I finally felt at peace. The nightmare was over and justice had prevailed. But more importantly, I had shown Karen and anyone like her that you can't exploit someone's sacrifice for your own gain. Because when push comes to shove, truth has a way of shining brighter than lies. For me, the house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was home. And no HOA Karen could ever take that away again.